Tonight on Nightfall Royals, we journey back to the Golden Age of England to follow the story of Queen Elizabeth I, from her troubled childhood as the daughter of Henry VIII to her rise as the Virgin Queen, and her long reign guiding England into an era of exploration and culture. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I'd love to hear in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world you're joining from. Wishing you a peaceful night under the same stars that once shone over Elizabethan England. On the 7th day of September, in the year 1533, Elizabeth Tudor was born at Greenwich Palace, the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. The birth was marked not by celebration, but by bitter disappointment. Henry had defied the Pope and broken England from the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in order to dissolve his marriage with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had borne him a daughter, Mary. Since the king ardently hoped that Anne Boleyn would give birth to a male heir, regarded as key to stable dynastic succession, the birth of a second daughter was a bitter disappointment that dangerously weakened the new queen's position. The infant princess entered a world of political upheaval and religious transformation. Her very existence represented her father's defiance of Rome, his break with centuries of Catholic tradition, and his desperate quest for a male heir. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had retired to Greenwich Palace to give birth, confident in her future as the mother of England's next king. Her optimistic father, Henry VIII, had shrugged off papal authority and become supreme head of a national church, in large part because he wanted a legitimate male heir. Elizabeth's earliest years were shadowed by the precarious position of her mother, Anne Boleyn. The woman who had captivated a king and changed the course of English history found herself increasingly vulnerable as Henry's affections cooled. The royal marriage that had shaken Europe to its foundations was crumbling under the weight of expectation and the absence of a son. Before Elizabeth reached her 3rd birthday, her father had her mother beheaded on charges of adultery and treason. Moreover, at Henry's instigation, an Act of Parliament declared his marriage with Anne Boleyn invalid from the beginning, thus making their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate, as Roman Catholics had all along claimed her to be. The little princess, not yet 3 years old, was suddenly thrust into a world where her legitimacy was questioned. Her mother was dead, and her father had declared her a bastard. The emotional impact of these events on the little girl, who had been brought up from infancy in a separate household at Hatfield, is not known. Presumably no one thought it worth recording. What was noted was her precocious seriousness. At 6 years old, it was admiringly observed, she had as much gravity as if she had been 40. Even in these dark circumstances, Elizabeth displayed remarkable resilience. She had inherited her father's keen intelligence and her mother's grace, qualities that would serve her well in the treacherous years ahead. The young princess learned early that survival depended on careful observation, measured responses, and an innate understanding of the delicate balance of court politics. When in 1537 Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, gave birth to a son, Edward, Elizabeth receded still further into relative obscurity, but she was not neglected. Despite his capacity for monstrous cruelty, Henry VIII treated all his children with what contemporaries regarded as affection. Elizabeth was present at ceremonial occasions and was declared 3rd in line to the throne. As our young princess settled into her new position as 3rd heir to the throne, the court around her continued to shift like autumn leaves in an English wind. The birth of her half-brother Edward brought both security and uncertainty. Security in knowing her father acknowledged her, but uncertainty about her future role in a kingdom that now had its longed-for male heir. Let this knowledge of Elizabeth's early resilience bring you comfort as you drift towards sleep, knowing that even in the darkest circumstances, strength and grace can flourish like roses in an English garden. She spent much of the time with her half-brother Edward and, from her 10th year onward, profited from the loving attention of her stepmother, Catherine Parr, the king's 6th and last wife. Catherine Parr proved to be the mother Elizabeth had never known, bringing warmth, intellectual curiosity and Protestant principles into the young princess's life. It was Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, who had the greatest impact upon Elizabeth's life. A kind woman who believed passionately in education and religious reform, Catherine was a devoted stepmother. Understandably, she had far more of an impact with the young Edward and Elizabeth than with Mary, who was just 4 years her junior. Catherine arranged for 10-year-old Elizabeth to have the most distinguished tutors in England, foremost among them Roger Ascham. Under Catherine Parr's guidance, Elizabeth received an education that was extraordinary for any child of the 16th century, but particularly remarkable for a girl. Under a series of distinguished tutors, of whom the best known is the Cambridge humanist Roger Ascham, Elizabeth received the rigorous education normally reserved for male heirs, consisting of a course of studies centering on classical languages, history, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. Roger Ascham, her most celebrated tutor, was deeply impressed by his royal pupil's intellectual capabilities. "Her mind has no womanly weakness," Ascham wrote with the unself-conscious sexism of the age. "Her perseverance is equal to that of a man, and her memory long keeps what it quickly picks up. And later, she readeth more Greek every day than some prebendaries of this church do in a whole week." And so she did. Elizabeth's love of scholarship never faltered, and, in an age when women were considered inferior to men, she was a glorious exception. In addition to Greek and Latin, she became fluent in French and Italian, attainments of which she was proud and which were in later years to serve her well in the conduct of diplomacy. The young princess approached her studies with remarkable dedication, understanding instinctively that knowledge was power, and power was survival in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. Along with such classical subjects as rhetoric, languages, philosophy, and history, Elizabeth also studied theology. Ascham and her other tutors were famous Cambridge humanists who supported the Protestant cause. Likewise, Catherine Parr was devoted to the Reformed faith. Unlike their half-sister Mary, both Edward and Elizabeth were raised Protestant during its most formative years, thus steeped in the secular learning of the Renaissance. The quick-witted and intellectually serious princess also studied theology, imbibing the tenets of English Protestantism in its formative period. Her association with the Reformation is critically important, for it shaped the future course of the nation. But it does not appear to have been a personal passion. Observers noted the young princess's fascination more with languages than with religious dogma. Even as a child, Elizabeth displayed the pragmatic approach to religion that would later characterize her reign. Yet while Edward was known for his piety and didacticism, Elizabeth already displayed the pragmatic character which would make her reign successful. She studied theology and supported the Protestant cause. She had been raised to do so and knew only Protestants recognized her parents' marriage. But she was never openly passionate about religion, recognizing its divisive role in English politics. The princess spent her days immersed in learning, translating classical texts, composing letters in multiple languages, and absorbing the complexities of statecraft through careful observation of her father's court. Most people viewed the adolescent Elizabeth as a serious young woman who always carried a book with her, preternaturally composed. She encouraged this perception, which was as accurate as any, by dressing with a degree of severity virtually absent at the Tudor royal court. As Elizabeth approached her teenage years, she had transformed from a disgraced bastard into a learned princess, whose intelligence impressed even the most educated men of her time. She carried herself with dignity and purpose, her red gold hair catching the light as she moved through the corridors of her various residences, always with a book in hand, always learning, always preparing for a future she could not yet fully envision. Let the image of young Elizabeth, surrounded by her beloved books and devoted teachers, bring you peace as you settle into sleep, knowing that education and wisdom are treasures that can never be taken away. With her father's death in 1547 and the accession to the throne of her frail 10-year-old brother Edward, Elizabeth's life took a perilous turn. At 14, Elizabeth found herself navigating a more dangerous political landscape than ever before. The death of Henry VIII had removed the protective, if unpredictable, presence of her father, leaving her vulnerable to the ambitions of others. Elizabeth was 13 years old when her father died. They were never particularly close, though he treated her with affection on her few visits to his court. He even occasionally discussed the possibility of her marriage for, in the 16th century, royal bastards were common and often used to great advantage in diplomacy. Her guardian, the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, almost immediately married Thomas Seymour, the Lord High Admiral. Handsome, ambitious, and discontented, Seymour began to scheme against his powerful older brother, Edward Seymour, protector of the realm during Edward VI's minority. Thomas Seymour's arrival in Catherine Parr's household brought danger disguised as charm. The dashing younger brother of the Lord Protector was not content with his position and saw opportunity in his proximity to the young princess. He also had terrible political instincts. Seymour was not content to be husband of the Dowager Queen of England. He was jealous of his brother's position and desperate to upstage him. For Elizabeth, the main problem with Seymour was his inappropriate and very flirtatious behavior. As a teenaged girl with little experience of men, she was flattered by his attention and also a bit frightened. Certainly it placed great strain on Catherine Parr, who had become pregnant soon after her marriage. The Queen originally participated in Seymour's early morning raids into Elizabeth's room, where he would tickle and wrestle with the girl in her nightdress. The situation grew increasingly uncomfortable and dangerous. But while Catherine considered this simple fun, her husband was more serious. He soon had keys made for every room in their house and started visiting Elizabeth while she was still asleep, and he was clad in just his nightshirt. She soon developed the habit of rising early. When he appeared, her nose was safely in a book. Elizabeth's intelligence and caution saved her from a potentially ruinous scandal. Even at 14, she understood the implications of Seymour's behavior and took steps to protect herself. Her early rising and constant reading became both shield and sword against unwanted advances. She left the Seymour home for Hatfield House in May 1548, ostensibly because the Queen was undoubtful of health. Elizabeth and Catherine exchanged affectionate letters, but they would not meet again. The Queen died on the 4th of September 1548 of childbed fever. The death of Catherine Parr removed Elizabeth's greatest protector and left Thomas Seymour free to pursue his dangerous ambitions. In January 1549, shortly after the death of Catherine Parr, Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason and accused of plotting to marry Elizabeth in order to rule the kingdom. Eventually, his grandiose plans unraveled and he was arrested. Perhaps the most damning charge was his planned marriage to Elizabeth. Immediately, the council sent Sir Robert Tewett to Hatfield with a mission to take control of Elizabeth's household and gain her confession. The young princess faced her first great test of character and survival. He immediately arrested Elizabeth's beloved governess Cat Ashley and her cofferer Thomas Parry. They were sent to the Tower. Now Tyrwhitt told the princess, confess all. He wanted confirmation of the charge that Seymour and Elizabeth planned to wed. If she confessed, Tyrwhitt said, she would be forgiven, for she was young and foolish. Her servants should have protected her. Elizabeth's response demonstrated the steel beneath her scholarly exterior. Under humiliating close questioning and in some danger, Elizabeth was extraordinarily circumspect and poised. When she was told that Seymour had been beheaded, she betrayed no emotion. Elizabeth did not hesitate to demonstrate her own wit and learning. Indeed, she drove Tyrwhitt to exasperation. In no way will she confess any practice by Mistress Ashley or the cofferer concerning my Lord Admiral. And yet I do see it in her face that she is guilty, and do perceive as yet she will abide more storms ere she accuse Mistress Ashley. He wrote to Somerset, I do assure your grace she hath a very good wit, and nothing is gotten of her but by great policy. Elizabeth refused to scapegoat her loyal servants, and maintained her innocence with remarkable composure for a 15-year-old facing experienced interrogators. Her performance impressed even her enemies and established her reputation for quick thinking under pressure. The crisis passed, but its lessons remained etched in Elizabeth's memory. She had learned that even those closest to her could bring danger, that her position made her a target for ambitious men, and that survival depended on careful speech, loyal servants, and unshakable composure. As sleep draws near, let Elizabeth's courage in the face of danger inspire your own dreams of strength and resilience, knowing that true character is forged in the crucible of adversity. The need for circumspection, self-control, and political acumen became even greater after the death of the Protestant Edward in 1553 and the accession of Elizabeth's older half-sister Mary, a religious zealot set on returning England, by force if necessary, to the Roman Catholic faith. The death of young Edward VI in 1553 plunged England into religious and political turmoil. When Edward VI became ill in 1553, and it was clear he would not survive, Dudley had a desperate plan to save himself from Mary I's Catholic rule: place Henry VIII's niece, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. The brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen, ended in tragedy, and Mary Tudor claimed her rightful throne. For Elizabeth, now 20 years old, Mary's accession brought both opportunity and mortal danger. This attempt, along with her unpopular marriage to the ardently Catholic King Philip II of Spain, aroused bitter Protestant opposition. In a charged atmosphere of treasonous rebellion and inquisitorial repression, Elizabeth's life was in grave danger. Mary had always disliked her half-sister for many reasons, not least because she sensed an innate shiftiness in Elizabeth's character. Elizabeth, Mary believed, was never to be trusted. Originally, this dislike was because of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Mary had long blamed Anne for her own mother's tragic end, as well as the alienation of her father's affections. Despite this underlying tension, Mary's initial treatment of Elizabeth was relatively generous. But at her accession, the moment of her great triumph, she was prepared to be conciliatory. Mary ordered that Elizabeth share her triumphal march through London. Their processions met at Wanstead on the 2nd of August. There Elizabeth dismounted and knelt in the road before her sister. Mary dismounted and raised her sister, embracing and kissing her with affection. The contrast between their physical appearances could not have been more striking. Mary at 37 was old beyond her years. An adulthood past in anxiety and tribulation had marred her health and appearance. She was small like her mother and thin, with Catherine's deep, almost gruff voice. Elizabeth was 19 years old, taller than her sister and slender, while Mary was richly attired in velvets covered in jewels and gold. Elizabeth was dressed in her usual strikingly severe style. Elizabeth understood perfectly that her Protestant faith made her the inevitable focus of Catholic resentment and Protestant hopes, for though, as her sister demanded, she conformed outwardly to official Catholic observance, she inevitably became the focus and the obvious beneficiary of plots to overthrow the government and restore Protestantism. The most serious threat came in early 1554 with Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion. When Sir Thomas Wyatt, the son of her mother's great poetic admirer, led a rebellion in January 1554, matters came to an unpleasant impasse. Wyatt had written to Elizabeth that he intended to overthrow Mary, but his letter was intercepted, as was a letter from de Noailles to the King of France. Arrested and sent to the Tower of London after Sir Thomas Wyatt's rebellion in January 1554, Elizabeth narrowly escaped her mother's fate. The very walls where Anne Boleyn had awaited execution now held her daughter, and Elizabeth must have contemplated the terrifying possibility that she might follow her mother to the scaffold. Elizabeth was terrified. The mere mention of the Tower was enough to shatter her already fragile nerves. She begged to be allowed to write to her sister, and the men agreed. The letter was long, rambling, and repetitious, proof of her fear and trepidation. In her letter to Mary, Elizabeth wrote with desperate eloquence, "I have heard in my time of many cast away for want of coming to the presence of their prince, therefore once again kneeling with humbleness of my heart, because I am not suffered to bow the knees of my body, I humbly crave to speak with your highness, which I would not be so bold to desire if I knew not myself most clear as I know myself most true." 2 months later, after extensive interrogation and spying had revealed no conclusive evidence of treason on her part, she was released from the Tower and placed in close custody for a year at Woodstock. Elizabeth's imprisonment at Woodstock was a masterclass in survival under pressure. The Queen had ordered that her sister be treated honorably and given limited freedom. Elizabeth was allowed to walk in the orchard and gardens. She also requested numerous books. Throughout the unhappy years of Mary's childless reign, with its burning of Protestants and its military disasters, Elizabeth had continually to protest her innocence, affirm her unwavering loyalty, and proclaim her pious abhorrence of heresy. It was a sustained lesson in survival through self-discipline and the tactful manipulation of appearances. The princess learned to navigate the treacherous waters of religious politics with increasing skill. She attended Mass as required, but her Protestant sympathies were well known. She walked the razor's edge between compliance and conviction, between survival and principle. The years of Mary's reign taught Elizabeth invaluable lessons about patience, diplomacy, and the art of strategic ambiguity. She learned to keep her own counsel, to speak carefully, and to present different faces to different audiences without ever quite lying about her fundamental beliefs. As Mary's reign drew to its close, marked by military failures, economic problems, and religious persecution, Elizabeth waited at Hatfield, still under supervision but increasingly seen as England's hope for a brighter future. Let the image of Elizabeth's patience during these dark years bring you comfort, knowing that even the longest winter must eventually give way to spring. Elizabeth I, the 7th of September 1533 to 24 March 1603, was Queen of England and Ireland from the 17th of November 1558 until her death in 1603. The morning of November 17, 1558, dawned grey and cold at Hatfield House, where Elizabeth had spent much of her adult life in varying degrees of captivity and freedom. There is an apocryphal story about Elizabeth's accession. In it, she was out in the meadows surrounding Hatfield when the courtiers approached. They bowed before her and presented Mary's signet ring. Elizabeth supposedly fell upon her knees and exclaimed, most aptly, "A domino factum est illit, et est mirabili in oculi nostris." This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Whether this story is true or not, it captures the miraculous nature of Elizabeth's survival and accession. The bastard daughter of a beheaded queen, declared illegitimate by her own father, imprisoned by her sister, had now become Queen of England at the age of 25. The citizens of London undoubtedly felt the same. Upon receiving word of Mary's death, bonfires were lit and tables were set in the streets for a grand celebratory feast. The Protestant queen they had long hoped for had finally come to the throne, and their joy was unrestrained. But Elizabeth inherited a kingdom in crisis. When she became queen in 1558, she was 25 years old, a survivor of scandal and danger, and considered illegitimate by most Europeans. She inherited a bankrupt nation, torn by religious discord, a weakened pawn between the great powers of France and Spain. A contemporary observer, however, commented wryly upon the state of affairs in England in 1558, the Queen poor, the realm exhausted, the nobility poor and decayed, want of good captains and soldiers, the people out of order, justice not executed, justices of peace unmeet for office, all things dear, excess of meat and drink and apparel, division among ourselves, war with France and Scotland, the French king, having one foot in Calais and the other in Scotland, steadfast enmity but no steadfast friendship abroad. She was only the third queen to rule England in her own right. The other two examples, her cousin Lady Jane Grey and half-sister Mary I, were disastrous. Even her supporters believed her position dangerous and uncertain. Her only hope, they counseled, was to marry quickly and lean upon her husband for support. But Elizabeth had other ideas. Elizabeth was well aware of the dire situation she faced. She herself had been the victim of the religious and political confusion of Mary's reign, and even the weather had been uncooperative for Queen Mary. The droughts which had plagued farmers led to high prices and much poverty. The new queen understood that her primary task was to bring stability to a nation exhausted by religious conflict and economic hardship. And so the new queen, though popular and much admired, did not inherit a stable and prosperous country, and the quest for stability and prosperity became the guiding force of her reign. To that end, she came to eschew foreign entanglements and religious extremism. Practical and pragmatic, Elizabeth chose as her motto, Semper Idem, always the same, and it was highly appropriate. Her succession was assured and untroubled. But Elizabeth knew that, when the celebrations ended, the real work would begin. Almost immediately, she would be forced to consider a rival claim to the throne by her cousin Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland since infancy, and now the wife of the French Dauphin and crowned Queen of France in 1559. Mary was denied a place in the Tudor succession by Henry VIII's will. From the moment of her accession, Elizabeth demonstrated the wisdom and political acumen that would characterize her reign. On the 20th of November, she held her first council meeting and appointed the loyal William Cecil as her principal Secretary of State. They had been friends for a long while, since his appointment as her accountant many years ago, and for the next 40 years, they were to rule England as a virtually inseparable team. Elizabeth's words to Cecil became one of the most famous speeches in English political history. "I give you this charge, that you shall be of my privy council and content to take pains for me and my realm. This judgment I have of you, that you will not be corrupted by any manner of gift, and that you will be faithful to the state, and that without respect of my private will you will give me that counsel which you think best, and if you shall know anything necessary to be declared to me of secrecy, you shall show it to myself only, and assure yourself I will not fail to keep taciturnity therein, and therefore herewith I charge you." The young queen also demonstrated her understanding of the importance of public relations and pageantry. Elizabeth well understood the importance of public relations and knew her entry into London must be a lavish spectacle. The coronation which would follow must be even more impressive. On November 28, 1558, Elizabeth made her first formal entry into London as queen. On Monday the 28th of November she left the Charterhouse to ride through London and to the Tower. She wore a purple velvet gown and had a scarf tied loosely around her neck. Dudley rode closely behind her. When they neared the Tower, both the Queen and her master of the horse appreciated the irony of the moment. Elizabeth said simply and wittily, "Some have fallen from being princes of this land to be prisoners in this place. I am raised from being prisoner in this place to be prince of this land. That dejection was a work of God's justice. This advancement is a work of His mercy." As Elizabeth settled into her royal duties, she revealed the character traits that would define her reign: intelligence, caution, pragmatism, and an unwavering dedication to England's welfare above all else. Let the image of Elizabeth, finally crowned and free, inspire your dreams of triumph over adversity, knowing that patience and perseverance can overcome even the darkest of circumstances. From the earliest moments of her reign, marriage dominated the political conversations surrounding Elizabeth. Already her expected marriage dominated European politics. No one expected her to rule alone. Yet Elizabeth had witnessed the disasters that royal marriages could bring. Her father's 6 marriages had brought little lasting happiness, and her sister Mary's union with Philip of Spain had made England a mere appendage of the Habsburg Empire. Elizabeth's seeming obliviousness to marriage, her refusal to discuss it, or her occasional witty but vague comments, all these infuriated her counselors. They seemed incapable of appreciating the impact marriage would have upon her life. While its impact was distressingly clear to Elizabeth, the Queen understood what her counselors could not: that marriage for a queen regnant was fundamentally different from marriage for any other woman. The counselors wanted a king and an heir, a natural enough desire, since her throne could not be completely secure without them. But Elizabeth knew herself to be intellectually superior to most men, and she relished her independence. And of course, her father's marital history as well as her sister's made her question both the personal and political cost of marriage. The new queen always had a low opinion of marital happiness, and saw little reason to change her mind. Among the suitors who sought her hand, none captured more attention than Robert Dudley, whom she had appointed Master of the Horse. The handsome Robert Dudley was appointed Master of the Horse. He was the son of the late Lord Protector, and had been imprisoned in the Tower with Elizabeth during Mary's reign. Not coincidentally, this position required close contact with the Queen. Thus, from the very beginning, a source of rivalry was established amongst Elizabeth's closest counselors. Their relationship became the subject of intense speculation and scandal. It was clear from the beginning that Robert Dudley was the Queen's favorite courtier. They were openly affectionate, and Dudley enjoyed flaunting the Queen's favor. But Dudley was married to Amy Robsart, a situation that both protected Elizabeth from more serious compromises and frustrated those who expected their relationship to develop into marriage. The situation reached a crisis in September 1560. Amy was living in secluded and deprived circumstances at Cumnor Place, the Oxfordshire manor of Anthony Foster, an MP and close friend of Dudley's. She had been ill for some time. On Sunday the 8th of September 1560, roughly 9 months after Elizabeth's coronation, she gave her few servants permission to visit a fair. When they returned, they found her lying dead at the bottom of the staircase with a broken neck. Amy's mysterious death freed Dudley to marry, but it also made such a marriage politically impossible. The scandal surrounding her death would have tainted any union between Elizabeth and Dudley. Elizabeth understood this immediately and, despite her genuine affection for Dudley, recognized that her duty to England must supersede her personal feelings. Foreign suitors continued to present themselves. Cecil's natural inclination was to make peace with England's traditional enemy, France. He urged a match with one of Queen Catherine de' Medici and King Henry II's sons to thwart Cecil. Other councillors pressed a Spanish marriage, perhaps even to her former brother-in-law Philip. The Queen expertly considered all options but never committed to any. This pattern would continue for decades. Elizabeth became a master of the marriage negotiation, using the possibility of matrimony as a diplomatic tool while never quite committing to any particular suitor. She understood that the moment she married, she would lose much of her power and freedom, and her husband's interests might not align with England's. Parliament grew increasingly frustrated with her refusal to marry or name a successor. In 1566, they formally petitioned her to marry, leading to one of Elizabeth's most famous outbursts. After insisting that the succession was too weighty an issue for such a knot of harebrains as the House of Commons, she warned them that, as your prince and head, it was up to her to judge such weighty political issues without parliamentary interference. "And to me it shall be a full satisfaction," she declared, "both for the memorial of my name, and for my glory also, if when I shall let my last breath, it be engraven upon my marble tomb, Here lieth Elizabeth, which reigned a virgin, and died a virgin." As the years passed and Elizabeth entered her 30s, then her 40s, the question of marriage gradually faded. She had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of matrimonial diplomacy, maintaining her independence while using marriage negotiations to her political advantage. The Virgin Queen, as she came to be known, had chosen England over personal happiness, duty over desire. In an age when women were expected to be governed by men, Elizabeth governed herself and her realm with singular determination. Let Elizabeth's strength in choosing her own path comfort you as you drift toward sleep. knowing that true power lies in staying true to one's deepest convictions. Elizabeth inherited a nation torn apart by religious conflict. Her Protestant counselors increasingly felt that Catholics were political traitors, as if their very faith implied a lack of patriotism. Her Catholic subjects, meanwhile, remained uncertain about their place in Protestant England. The new queen understood that her primary challenge was to forge a religious settlement that could bring peace to her divided realm. Elizabeth was content to ignore potential suitors. She considered religion to be the most pressing and divisive issue in England. Having lived through years of spiritual upheaval, she well understood her subjects' need for peace. But it would not be easy to find. Both Protestants and Catholics had suffered throughout the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. Each faith harbored grievances against the other. Elizabeth's approach was characteristically pragmatic. For the Queen, her Catholic subjects were also, quite simply, subjects. If they recognized her rule, she had no qualms about their private worship. Let them go publicly to Protestant services and then do as they wished at home. So long as they did not rebel, she was content not to pry. Elizabeth's first parliament met from January to April 1559, and religious reform was the primary focus. The new queen did not bother to revoke her illegitimacy, as Mary had. This was indicative of Elizabeth's self-confidence and her ability to let the past go. The royal supremacy. The royal title of Supreme Head of the Church of England was reinstated. Though altered to Supreme Governor, Elizabeth pressed for a restoration of the 1549 prayer book, which she felt would be acceptable to Protestants and most complacent Catholics. But the new bishops preferred the 1552 prayer book. It was rather vague about most controversial matters and thus less offensive to Catholics. Elizabeth effectively placed the Church under control of the Crown, thus merging religious and political power in her person. She was particularly successful in making religious dissension a political matter, rather than a troublesome question of doctrine. Most Englishmen were content with this settlement, though extremists on both sides felt it inadequate. An imperial envoy observed her approach with admiration. From the very beginning of her reign, she has treated all religious questions with so much caution and incredible prudence that she seems both to protect the Catholic religion and at the same time not entirely to condemn or outwardly reject the new Reformation. In my opinion, a very prudent action, intended to keep the adherents of both creeds in subjection. For the less she ruffles them at the beginning of her reign, the more easily she will enthrall them later on. This delicate balance served Elizabeth well for the first decade of her reign. Catholics in the north and west of England generally accepted the 1559 religious settlement. They believed Elizabeth to be illegitimate and thus ineligible to be queen. But neither Pope Paul IV nor his successor, Pius IV, seriously challenged her title. She was not even excommunicated until 1570. However, two developments in 1568 shattered this religious peace. First, Mary, Queen of Scots, fled her disastrous reign in Scotland to seek Elizabeth's help. Mary represented everything. Elizabeth was not a Catholic queen with a strong claim to the English throne. Beloved by Catholic Europe, her presence in England immediately made her a focal point for Catholic discontent. Second, a Catholic missionary college was founded at Douai in Flanders by the Englishman William Allen. He planned to take a proactive role in reasserting his faith in England, training priests specifically to return to England and reconvert the population. Douai soon became a flourishing center for anti-Elizabethan plots and propaganda. The conservative North had never been friendly to the Tudor dynasty, and Elizabeth's religious policies exacerbated their discontent. The arrival of Mary Stuart at Elizabeth's court in 1569 became the catalyst for rebellion. The northern earls, Northumberland and Westmoreland, along with the Duke of Norfolk, began plotting to free Mary and restore Catholicism. The Northern Rebellion began in 1569, but Elizabeth was fortunate in her enemies. Norfolk was indecisive. Should he risk his grand title and privileges for the possibility of becoming king? While he hesitated, the Earl of Sussex led his troops on a steady course north. The rebels themselves were often conflicted in their duties to the Queen and their church. When faced with the Queen's army, they returned home. The rebellion's failure had serious consequences. The conservative North would now be more carefully watched and controlled. More significantly, the rebellion prompted Pope Pius V to issue Regnans in Excelsis in March 1570. Formally excommunicating Queen Elizabeth I, she was deposed in the eyes of the Catholic Church, and her Catholic subjects were absolved of all loyalty and obedience to her. This papal bull transformed the religious landscape of England. English Catholics now faced an impossible choice: loyalty to their queen or loyalty to their faith. Elizabeth's response was characteristically measured but firm. Parliament made it treason to declare Elizabeth a heretic or to question her right to rule. The fines for recusants, those who did not attend Protestant church services, were increased dramatically. Elizabeth had sought to avoid religious persecution, but the papal bull forced her hand. The question was no longer one of private conscience but of public loyalty. Catholics who remained in England would now be viewed with suspicion, their very faith seen as potential treason. As this momentous decade drew to a close, Elizabeth had successfully established her religious settlement, but at a cost. The England of 1570 was more divided than the England of 1558, and the Queen's life was now in greater danger than ever before. Let the knowledge of Elizabeth's pursuit of religious peace bring you comfort, knowing that wisdom lies in seeking understanding between different beliefs. The excommunication of 1570 marked the beginning of the most dangerous period of Elizabeth's reign. No longer was she simply a Protestant queen ruling Catholic subjects. She was now, in the eyes of Rome and Catholic Europe, a heretic usurper, whose very existence was an affront to God. The papal bull transformed potential political opposition into a holy crusade. Mary Stuart's presence in England became increasingly problematic. Elizabeth and her counselors were aghast at finding themselves custodians of the woman many Catholics considered the rightful Queen of England. Just as Elizabeth had been the inevitable focus of conspiracies and plots against Mary I's rule, Mary Queen of Scots would be the focus of discontent against Elizabeth. The imprisoned Scottish Queen initially believed Elizabeth would help her return to Scotland. She sincerely believed Elizabeth would help her as a fellow queen and cousin. She never recognized the political danger she brought to bear upon her sweet sister. But as the months turned to years, and Elizabeth made clear that there would be no assistance in regaining her throne, Mary's attitude hardened. Those early years in England were spent in various hearings and meetings, with Mary proclaiming her innocence of her husband Darnley's murder and the duplicity of her Scottish nobles. When these ended with her freedom still denied, she became understandably bitter. For a lively young woman who had always lived openly and passionately, used to being her own mistress and the former queen of two countries, the situation was intolerable. At first, Mary was content to avoid plotting against her cousin. But when it became clear that Elizabeth would not help her return to Scotland, she was forced into a corner. She was essentially powerless, and so she turned to subterfuge, relying upon a small network of Catholic and foreign allies. The first major conspiracy came in 1583, known as the Throckmorton Plot, after its leader Sir Francis Throckmorton, a well-born Catholic Englishman. Throckmorton was given money and guidance by the French prince, the Duc de Guise. The Guise wished to invade Scotland and England simultaneously, murder Elizabeth with the assistance of English Catholics, and then place Mary on the throne. Elizabeth's great spy master Sir Francis Walsingham discovered the plot through his network of agents. The 30-year-old Throckmorton was arrested and tortured before confessing everything. He was executed at Tyburn on July 10, 1584, based upon his confession. The Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza was expelled from England. The discovery of the Throckmorton plot terrified Elizabeth's counselors. In June 1584, Even as Throckmorton awaited execution, the Protestant leader William of Orange was assassinated at Delft by a Catholic fanatic. Elizabeth's counselors became convinced that similar attempts would be made on their queen's life. Cecil and Walsingham drafted the Bond of Association, a document which pledged protection of the Queen and destruction of her enemies. In January 1585, Walsingham arranged for Mary Queen of Scots to be moved to Tutbury Castle, where her correspondence could be more carefully monitored. Elizabeth approved of these plans but refused to alter her many public appearances for fear of an assassin. This caused her counselors many sleepless nights, but they could not help but admire her bravery. She also took to keeping a small sword beneath her pillow in case of an attack, her only sign of distress and perfectly in keeping with her pragmatic approach to life. The final and most dangerous plot came in 1586, orchestrated by a young Catholic named Anthony Babington, another well-born Englishman. Babington had served as a page in Shrewsbury's household during the early years of Mary's imprisonment. His romanticized memories of the Queen, as well as his passionate Catholicism, made him susceptible to the plans of Thomas Morgan, one of Mary's trusted agents. Walsingham allowed the conspiracy to develop, knowing it would provide the evidence he needed to finally convince Elizabeth that Mary must die. When Babington learned that the Catholic priest Ballard planned to murder Elizabeth, he tried to escape abroad, but Walsingham refused him a passport. The crucial moment came when Mary explicitly approved the murder of Elizabeth in a letter to Babington. Walsingham had intercepted and read all her correspondence, and this letter provided the definitive proof of her treasonous intent. When confronted with the evidence, Elizabeth was at first disbelieving and then angry. She approved of moving Mary to Tutbury Castle and sending a commission of statesmen there to investigate the Babington plot. Mary defended herself at the resulting trial, arguing that as a sovereign queen, she was not liable to the laws of England. But it was too late. She was condemned to death. Elizabeth at first refused to sign the warrant for execution, much as she had earlier with Norfolk. It was an agonizing decision for a queen who understood the sanctity of royal blood and the dangerous precedent of executing an anointed monarch. Mary was finally beheaded on February 8, 1587. Elizabeth later claimed she had been tricked into signing the warrant, and her grief and anger at the execution seemed genuine. She understood that in ordering Mary's death, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots removed the greatest threat to Elizabeth's personal safety, but it also ensured that war with Catholic Europe was now inevitable. Philip II of Spain, already angered by English support for Dutch rebels and attacks on Spanish shipping, now had both justification and obligation to invade England. As Elizabeth entered the most dangerous year of her reign, she could at least rest assured that the long shadow of Mary Stuart no longer fell across her throne. But greater challenges lay ahead. Let the knowledge of Elizabeth's courage in facing mortal danger bring you peace, knowing that true bravery lies not in the absence of fear, but in doing what is right despite that fear. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots in February 1587 reverberated across Catholic Europe like thunder across a stormy sky. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, had already been contemplating an invasion of England. Now he had both divine mandate and political justification for what he called the enterprise of England. Elizabeth had long understood that conflict with Spain was becoming inevitable. As much as she preferred to prevaricate and remain neutral, she was being forced to choose sides. The execution of Mary provided Philip with a perfect pretext for a war he had been planning for years. Philip's grand strategy was breathtaking in its scope. He would assemble the largest fleet the world had ever seen, sail north to the English Channel, collect the Duke of Parma's veteran army from the Netherlands, and then invade England. Once Elizabeth was deposed and executed, England would return to the Catholic faith, and Philip would either rule directly or install a puppet monarch. Preparations for the Great Fleet, the Spanish Armada, had been underway since 1586. Philip spared no expense. commissioning 130 ships carrying 8,000 sailors and 18,000 soldiers. The fleet carried enough supplies for 6 months at sea and sufficient weaponry to arm additional Catholic supporters once they landed in England. Elizabeth's resources were far more modest. The Royal Navy consisted of only 34 ships, though they were among the finest warships in the world. Her total forces numbered perhaps 20,000 men, many of them hastily trained militia with little combat experience. On paper, England appeared hopelessly outmatched, but Elizabeth possessed advantages that Philip had not fully considered. The English ships were smaller and more maneuverable than the massive Spanish galleons. English captains like Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher had years of experience in naval warfare. Most importantly, England was fighting for its very existence. Elizabeth's response to the Spanish threat revealed her at her most magnificent. Rather than hiding behind palace walls, she chose to inspire her people through personal example. Her courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds became legendary. The first confrontation came in April 1587, when Francis Drake led a daring raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz, in what he famously called singeing the King of Spain's beard. Drake destroyed or damaged numerous Spanish ships and delayed the Armada's departure by a full year. Elizabeth supported Drake's raid but maintained the careful balance of aggression and diplomacy that characterized her foreign policy. She had authorized the attack, but she also sent apologetic messages to Philip, hoping to avoid or delay the inevitable confrontation. Throughout 1587 and early 1588, as Spanish preparations continued, Elizabeth's government worked frantically to prepare England's defenses. Beacon fires were prepared along the coast to signal the Armada's approach. Local militias were organized and drilled. Ships were commandeered and armed. The Queen even pawned some of her jewelry to help finance the preparations. The Armada finally sailed from Lisbon in May 1588, but storms forced it to take shelter in Corunna for repairs. It was not until July 19th that English lookouts spotted the Spanish fleet off the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. The long-awaited invasion had begun. Elizabeth's admirals wanted to sail out immediately and attack the Spanish fleet, but she overruled them. Her strategy was to let the Armada proceed up the Channel, while English ships harassed them from the rear and flanks. This would prevent the Spanish from landing while forcing them toward the dangerous waters off the Dutch coast. The strategy worked perfectly. For 8 days, English ships shadowed the Armada, launching hit-and-run attacks while staying out of range of Spanish guns. The Spanish fleet maintained its formation but suffered increasing damage and casualties. The decisive moment came at Gravelines on July 29th. The Spanish fleet, having failed to collect Parma's army, was forced to fight a major naval battle in choppy seas. English ships, more maneuverable and better gunned, inflicted severe damage on the Spanish fleet. Several Spanish ships were sunk or captured, and many others were badly damaged. With his fleet battered and his invasion plan in ruins, the Duke of Medina Sidonia ordered a retreat. The Spanish fleet would have to sail around Scotland and Ireland to return to Spain, a perilous journey that would claim more ships than the battles in the Channel. Elizabeth's victory was complete, but she did not yet know it. Spanish ships were still in English waters, and the threat of invasion remained real. It was at this moment of maximum peril that Elizabeth made her most famous appearance. On August 9, 1588, she traveled to Tilbury, where her land forces were encamped to repel any Spanish landing. Dressed in white and silver, wearing a breastplate over her gown, she rode among her soldiers on a white horse. Her speech that day became one of the most stirring in English history. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Parma or Spain, or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." The Armada's defeat was complete by September, though news traveled slowly in the 16th century. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, fewer than 70 returned, and many of those were badly damaged. Perhaps 15,000 Spaniards died in the campaign more from disease and storms than from English guns. Elizabeth's victory over the Spanish Armada marked the emergence of England as a major naval power. More importantly for her personally, it vindicated her entire approach to governing. Her careful balance of aggression and restraint, her ability to inspire loyalty through personal example, and her pragmatic approach to both religion and politics had saved England from its greatest threat. The defeat of the Armada also marked the beginning of England's rise as a global power. English merchants and explorers would soon challenge Spanish dominance in the New World. The foundations of the British Empire were laid in the waters of the English Channel in that memorable summer of 1588. As you drift towards sleep, let the image of Elizabeth at Tilbury, brave, defiant, and utterly committed to her people's welfare, inspire your own dreams of courage and determination. The defeat of the Spanish Armada ushered in what many considered the golden age of Elizabeth's reign. The immediate threat of invasion was gone. England's prestige had soared across Europe, and the Queen had proven herself one of the greatest rulers of her age. Yet even in triumph, Elizabeth faced new challenges and the inevitable passage of time. The victory over Spain brought immediate practical benefits. English merchants, no longer fearing Spanish retaliation, expanded their trade routes across the globe. Explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to establish colonies in the New World. The arts flourished as never before, supported by a growing merchant class and the confidence that came from military victory. This was the age of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. Elizabeth's court became a center of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled any in Europe. The Queen herself, with her love of music, poetry, and learning, set the tone for this cultural renaissance. Elizabeth's progress as her travels throughout her realm became grander and more frequent in the years following the Armada. These journeys allowed her to maintain personal contact with her subjects and demonstrated the security of her realm. No longer did she travel as a queen under threat. She moved through England as a triumphant sovereign surveying her peaceful domain. The Queen's relationship with Parliament evolved during these later years. Having proven her competence in the great crisis of 1588, she faced less pressure to marry or name a successor. Parliament still grumbled about various issues: monopolies, taxation, religious policy, but the fundamental question of Elizabeth's fitness to rule had been definitively answered. Religious issues, while not entirely resolved, became more manageable. The defeat of Catholic Spain had discredited the more extreme Catholic plotters. English Catholics, seeing that Elizabeth's rule was both secure and relatively tolerant, largely accommodated themselves to the Protestant settlement. The Puritan movement remained troublesome but posed no immediate threat to the Queen's authority. Ireland presented ongoing challenges throughout this period. The Irish remained largely Catholic and resented English rule. A series of rebellions culminated in the 9 Years' War 1594 to 1603, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Elizabeth was forced to send large armies and spend enormous sums to maintain English control over Ireland. The Irish Wars revealed both Elizabeth's determination and the limits of her power. She was unwilling to abandon English claims to Ireland, but the cost of maintaining control strained her treasury and tested her subjects' patience. The successful conclusion of the wars came only in the final months of her reign. Foreign relations in the post-Armada period required careful management. Spain remained hostile but weakened. France was torn by religious civil war until Henry IV restored order in the 1590s. Elizabeth maintained a complex diplomatic balance, supporting Protestant allies where possible while avoiding commitments that might drain England's resources. The question of succession, while no longer urgent, remained unresolved. Elizabeth never married and had no children. Her closest heir was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth maintained cordial relations with James while carefully avoiding any formal designation of him as her successor. As Elizabeth aged, the court around her changed. Many of her oldest advisors and friends died. William Cecil in 1598, after 40 years of faithful service. New favorites emerged, most notably Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, whose relationship with the aging Queen would end in tragedy. Essex, young, handsome, and ambitious, captured Elizabeth's affection in her later years, much as Robert Dudley had in her youth. But Essex lacked Dudley's political wisdom and self-control. His reckless pursuit of military glory and political power ultimately led him to rebellion in 1601. The Essex rebellion was poorly planned and easily suppressed, but it broke Elizabeth's heart. She had loved Essex as a son, and his betrayal reminded her of her own mortality and the fragility of human loyalty. Essex was executed in February 1601, one of the last acts of judicial severity in Elizabeth's reign. The final years of Elizabeth's reign were marked by economic difficulties and political uncertainties. The costs of the Irish Wars, combined with inflation and poor harvests, strained the royal finances. Parliament became increasingly assertive, challenging royal monopolies and demanding greater control over taxation. Elizabeth's famous Golden Speech to Parliament in November 1601 revealed both her awareness of these challenges and her enduring commitment to her people's welfare. "Though God hath raised me high," she declared, "yet this I count the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves." As Elizabeth entered her 70th year, her health began to decline. She had always been vigorous and active, but the accumulated stresses of 45 years of rule were taking their toll. She suffered from insomnia, loss of appetite, and periods of deep melancholy. The Queen's courtiers began to prepare for the inevitable transition. Correspondence with James VI of Scotland increased, though Elizabeth herself remained reluctant to formally name him as her successor. She had spent her entire adult life wielding power, and she was reluctant to acknowledge that her reign must end. Elizabeth died peacefully at Richmond Palace on March 24, 1603, surrounded by her faithful courtiers. Her last reported words were, "All my possessions for a moment of time," though this may be apocryphal. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 44 years and 4 months. The transition to James I proceeded smoothly, testament to Elizabeth's success in establishing stable institutions and a secure succession. England had been transformed during her reign from a weak, divided kingdom into a major European power with global ambitions. As we near the end of our journey through Elizabeth's remarkable life, let her legacy of service and dedication inspire your own dreams of leaving the world better than you found it. Elizabeth Tudor died as she had lived on her own terms, having shaped her destiny and that of her nation through 4.5 decades of remarkable rule. She had come to the throne as a young woman of 25, surrounded by doubters and enemies, inheriting a kingdom torn by religious strife and threatened by powerful foreign foes. She died as England's greatest monarch, leaving behind a nation transformed and a legacy that would endure for centuries. Her death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty, but it also marked the beginning of England's emergence as a global power. The foundations she had laid, religious tolerance, naval supremacy, commercial expansion, and cultural achievement, would support the rise of the British Empire. The Elizabethan age had created the conditions for England's future greatness. Elizabeth's achievement was all the more remarkable for being so improbable in an age when women were considered intellectually and emotionally inferior to men. She had proven herself the equal of any king. In a time when religious fanaticism tore nations apart, she had forged a practical settlement that brought peace to her realm. In an era when dynastic marriages were the foundation of international relations, she had used her unmarried state as a diplomatic weapon. Her choice to remain unmarried, the decision that had so frustrated her contemporaries, proved to be among her wisest. By refusing to share her throne with a husband, she had maintained complete control over English policy. By declining to subordinate England's interests to those of a foreign dynasty through marriage, she had preserved England's independence. By embracing the role of the Virgin Queen, she had created a powerful symbolic identity that transcended the limitations of gender. Elizabeth's religious settlement, though criticized by extremists on both sides, provided the stability that England desperately needed. Her pragmatic approach, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls," allowed Catholics and Protestants to coexist peacefully for most of her reign. The Church of England that emerged from her reign was distinctly English in character, neither Roman Catholic nor Continental Protestant, but something uniquely suited to the English temperament. Her economic policies, while sometimes controversial, had restored England's finances and encouraged the growth of trade and industry. The chartered companies she authorized: the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the East India Company laid the groundwork for England's commercial empire. The privateers she supported had challenged Spanish dominance of the seas and brought vast wealth to England. The cultural flowering of the Elizabethan age was perhaps her most enduring legacy. The literature, music, and theatre of her reign remain unmatched in English history. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and countless others created works that continued to inspire and entertain for centuries later. The intellectual ferment of Elizabeth's court, with its blend of humanism, patriotism, and artistic achievement, set standards that future generations would strive to equal. Elizabeth's personal qualities, her intelligence, courage, and dedication to duty, became models for future monarchs. Her famous progresses through the countryside, her accessibility to her subjects, and her genuine care for their welfare established traditions of royal service that continue to this day. She had shown that true sovereignty came not from divine right alone, but from the love and respect of one's people. Her handling of foreign affairs demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of England's limitations and opportunities. She had avoided costly foreign wars while supporting England's interests abroad. Her naval policies had defeated the greatest invasion force ever assembled against England. Her diplomatic skills had maintained England's independence while playing the great powers against each other. The transition following her death proved the stability of the institutions she had created. James I, despite being a foreigner and a man of very different temperament, was able to assume the throne peacefully. The religious settlement held firm. The administrative system continued to function effectively. Parliament maintained its traditional role while accepting royal authority. Elizabeth's influence on the English language itself was profound. The translations of the Bible produced during her reign, the plays performed in her theatres, the poetry written in her court all helped to shape English into the magnificent literary instrument it would become. Her own speeches, with their memorable phrases and stirring rhetoric, contributed to this linguistic renaissance. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth had proven that England could stand alone against the great powers of Europe and not merely survive, but prosper. The confidence her reign generated would inspire English achievements for generations to come. The belief that a small island nation could challenge much larger empires and prevail became part of the English national character. Her court had been a school for statesmen. The men she trained, William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, Robert Cecil, and many others, carried her methods and principles into the next reign. The administrative techniques she had developed continued to serve England well into the 17th century. Elizabeth's example as a woman ruler was particularly significant. In an age when female monarchy was viewed with suspicion and hostility, she had proven that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. Her success paved the way for future female monarchs and challenged assumptions about women's capabilities that had persisted for centuries. The myths and legends that grew up around Elizabeth in the years following her death only added to her historical impact. She became good Queen Bess, Gloriana the Virgin Queen, a figure larger than life who embodied the best qualities of her nation. These romantic images, while not always historically accurate, helped to sustain English national identity through subsequent challenges and conflicts. Modern historians continue to debate various aspects of Elizabeth's reign: her treatment of Catholics, her involvement in the slave trade, her harsh policies in Ireland. But none of these criticisms, valid though they may be, can diminish the magnitude of her overall achievement. She had taken a weak, divided, and threatened kingdom and transformed it into a confident, prosperous, and influential nation. Elizabeth Tudor remains, for centuries after her death, one of history's most fascinating and accomplished rulers. Her life story, from the tragic child whose mother was executed for treason to the triumphant queen who saved her nation from invasion, continues to inspire people around the world. She proved that intelligence, determination, and unwavering commitment to duty could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. As we conclude our journey through the life of this remarkable woman, let her example inspire your own dreams of achievement and service. Like Elizabeth, we all face challenges that seem insurmountable at times. Like her, we must find the courage to persist when others doubt us. And like her, we can choose to dedicate our lives to something greater than ourselves. May the story of Elizabeth Tudor, England's Virgin Queen, bring you peaceful sleep and dreams of your own potential for greatness. In the gentle embrace of the night, remember that true sovereignty lies not in dominating others, but in mastering oneself, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is a world made better by our presence. Rest now, and good night.